handle the world, Homo creativus, in its highest levels, would be the creatively gifted. They'd be the inventors, those with the new ideas, the innovators. And if we look at some scientific results, studies correlating measures of intellectual giftedness like IQ with creative behavior, productions, or other measures of creativity, the correlations tend to be in the 0.10 to 0.20 range, which is quite low. And according to a meta-analysis by Kim in 2005, the average correlation is 0.17. If we look at correlations between school grades, a sort of performance measure of the intellectually gifted, and creativity, the correlations are kind of low, ranging from around -20 to +10, usually. Because doing well at school involves being an expert in an academic system that doesn't necessarily focus on creativity. So when you tell teachers that's the correlation, they go, oh, okay, everything's good and normal. It hasn't been just a tendency to focus on intellectual giftedness and academic performance in the field, in the schools. But if we look in the literature on giftedness, I looked back from 1975 to 2012. It's approximately the last 20 years, because this is the 20th conference of international gifted, and this covers 1975 up through today. If you look at the first Congress and today's Congress, that's the period covered. And so the red line, you see, is based on ERIC database, the number of articles and hits you get when you type in giftedness per year. For example, in 1980, you get a little less than 450 articles on giftedness. And when you type in creative giftedness, that's a subset of the total, and that's the blue line you see on the bottom. It's about 10% per year. If you use PsycInfo database, you get essentially the same kind of result, 10% per year of the total articles published on giftedness concern creative giftedness. Okay. However, we could argue that creativity has become a 21st century imperative. If you look at some of the recent reports, like the 2010 IBM Global CEO Study, in more than 60 countries with 1,500 CEOs, they identified creativity as the top leadership quality needed during the next 5 years. If you look at the 2013 survey of more than 4,000 K-12 and higher education teachers and parents in the United States, UK, Germany, and Australia, you've got up to 90% of parents and up to 87% of educators agreeing that to foster creativity in education today will fuel the economy of the future. And they're also highly agreeing that more can be done to teach creativity. Now, to get ourselves going, I'd like to propose to you a working definition of creativity. That's a big topic in the literature. How can we define creativity? But we're not going to focus today on that issue, although it is important. There's a lot of literature. And I'm going to suggest to you that creativity is an ability to produce work, ideas, all kinds of productions. And these productions have two main characteristics. First of all, the production has to be something novel, original, different from what the person has already done and what others in their social environment have already done or tend to do. And this novel, original work, it has to also fit with the constraints of the task, of the situation. It has to be meaningful. It has to be context appropriate. If you look at this example of drawings on the topic, how does an insect see the world? you get these kinds of drawings that people make. If you saw hundreds of these, you would notice that the big foot idea, the big shoe, is very common. And you would rapidly say that's not too original or unusual or creative, although it fits the topic. The other drawing is quite unusual. It's rare, it fits the topic, and it's based on insects having eyes that see many parts of the world at the same time, which is a rather interesting vision of the insect's view of the world. Now, if you go further into the definition of creativity, you can find that in the 21st century skills movement that perhaps you have heard about, many states are adhering to this movement in their educational policy. Creativity is one of the key skills for the 21st century, and it's defined in this educational program in the following ways. First of all, it involves being able to generate, elaborate, refine, and evaluate new ideas. It involves being able to use a range of creation techniques like brainstorming and other kinds of thinking that could help people be creative. It involves being open, collaborating on new ideas, and communicating your new ideas so that people can understand what's the value in the new idea you have. And it involves acting on your new ideas, implementing innovations, and not just keeping the idea in a proto-state. Okay, so that was a few words on defining creativity so that we have a common understanding of what we're going to talk about. Now here's the little outline for what's coming up. First of all, I'm going to talk about what I call the raw materials of creativity, because if you want the blueprint for a creative educational system, that means you're going to build the system. And so you need to have some raw materials to build the system. And this is what we know. The raw materials to build a creative educational system are the main essential things we know about creativity. That's what we're going to look at first. Then we're going to look at the building blocks that we need for a creative educational system, with a few words about the children who have to come to school and the teachers who teach in this system, about the curriculum and the classroom environment, and about school administrators and leaders who organize this system, then a few words of conclusion. So that's what's coming up. Okay, so let's talk about the basic things to know about creativity so that we can build this, have this blueprint for a creative educational system. So this is what I call the material sciences of creativity. If you want to make a building, you need material sciences to know how does concrete work, under what temperature or what pressure will concrete support a certain weight. You need material sciences to know about the matter that you're going to use in your building. Well, this is my short list of the very most important things to know about creativity. So I tried to condense it here to one slide, and I'll take a couple minutes to give you some examples of these key points. The idea is that if we understand these key points, you could build an appropriate school educational environment that takes into account these things about creativity. So we have that creative potential involves cognitive and cognitive factors. It involves thinking skills and personality, motivational type of factors. The process of creating is important. It's not just having these abilities and factors, but it's how you put them into play. Creativity is somewhat domain specific, so we're not going to train kids to be creative in general. This is an idea I'm going to suggest. Creativity evolves over time. It's not totally stable, and it can be developed, which is good news for our educational system. And everyday and great creativity are related, which allows us to go from creative potential, high creative potential, the creative gifted, to eventually, potentially, great cases of creativity, Einstein and company. So now, an example of the cognitive factors for creativity. I'm going to talk about divergent thinking, which I suppose you've all heard about. So you're going to go in many directions with a topic. Here's a very classic task called using a cardboard box. It was used by Guilford, and it was used by Torrance and others. Very commonly used. And so here, some child gave 9 ideas how to use the box, and other children gave ideas, and we can find that in the sequence of this child's ideas, some are more common than others. An idea like putting games in a box for storage is very common. An idea like growing plants in a box is quite rare. And we could be interested, how does divergent thinking work? Why is it important for creativity? Well, if you take this sequence and many children's sequences of ideas and you cut it into 2 parts, the beginning sequence and the later part of their sequence, and you calculate the average originality of ideas, you find this result. You find that the first half of kids' ideas tend to be less original than the second half of their list. You find that their first idea and their second idea tend to be quite less original than their last idea and next to last penultimate idea. As you go further, you get away from common ideas into the new territory. So divergent thinking, it involves association, it involves flexibility, but it involves going as far as you can go and getting to that place that others might not get to. So that's an important thing to understand as one of the cognitive components of creativity. What about a personality component? Let's take risk-taking, very important trait of personality related to creativity. In some research, we've asked children and adults to tell us if they were going to draw a picture or write a story or do something potentially creative, and they had a choice between one way of doing the task, which was more sure to be successful but not too original, like making a fire, illustrating a children's book about a story of a fire and using a classical fire engine drawing, or illustrating that book with some kind of unusual drawing, like a Picasso fire engine drawing. Would the child or adult take that risky Picasso Cubist style, which might be a great success or a great failure, or would they go for the more classical, less risky drawing? It turns out that the more people are willing to go for that risky Cubist style drawing, it's predictive of how creative they are when they actually make drawings. If they say and describe themselves as a risk taker, it's in favor of being actually creative in their work. Of course, risk-taking in artistic works, it's not very predictive of how creative they are in other domains like literary creativity, where they can be more or less risk-taking in a different topic. Here's another study about risk-taking, somewhat different from our creativity focus, but Clifford and colleagues did a series of work on what's called academic risk-taking, or also self-reported school failure tolerance, and found that academic risk-taking and school failure tolerance decrease as you go through school in general. So students, in this kind of study, students were examined in various schools, but notably in this example, in an above-average school system, grades 3 to 6. They were given a choice of 35 problems and asked to choose 6 problems to do, the ones they would enjoy the most, and they would get 1 point for each right answer. 4th graders chose problems, on average, for kids who were supposed to be between grade 3 and 4. So on average, grade 3.5 problems. 5th graders chose problems, on average, listed as typical problems for grade 4 kids. And 6th graders, on average, enjoyed most to choose problems that were more than a year and a half below their actual school level. they had learned that there's no need to take a risk unnecessarily, and it's more enjoyable to get a point with certainty rather than to take the risk and try something more difficult. And similar results, similar studies in China, in France, and some other places. So these are some of the factors that contribute to creativity. Now a few words about the creative process. It's not just having the right ingredients to be creative. You gotta put them into play. Here's a study with students at the university. They're art students. They produced during the semester an artwork for their class in art, fine arts, and they kept a notebook of different things they were thinking as they worked during their weeks of work, including checking off different aspects of the creative process of how they were thinking each time they came to the studio. Here's a kind of sculpture that one student produced, just to show you an example of this kind of artwork they were doing. It turns out that in the class of art students, we were able to identify some, who we call the C+, the high creatives. They had quite high grades in the French system out of 20 points possible. And we had the C-, who were just passing the course. And we have some students who were quite low on creativity according to art experts. We looked at what was the process that they went through, what steps and kinds of thinking did they go from one to the next moment in their creative work. Well, here's the pattern of where you start and where you go, a flow chart for the creative students, the C+ students. So for example, if you start out questioning what you're going to do, you might go to define your problem and then to document, for example. So you move around, and these are the paths that the most creative students tended to follow over their weeks of work. Here's the C- group. Now, it's the same steps of creative process, but their path is rather different, and it's a bit more chaotic. They're running around everywhere in this sequence of thinking, you see. They have a different process. If you look at something like defining the problem as one step in the creative process, once you're thinking about defining your problem, the high creatives tend to move to getting documentation, and the low creatives tend to start experimenting and trying stuff in the studio right away. Also, they feel these steps differently. The high creatives, when they're experimenting, trying stuff, they feel positive, they're motivated. And the low creatives are very stressed, experiencing doubt and frustration as they're trying stuff in the studio. So the creative process matters. What about being creative in different domains? If you're creative in science, will you be a creative artist? Will you be a creative writer, designer, or composer? Well, this is a summary of lots of studies in the literature. If you give people a drawing task and a story task, the correlations tend to be positive, but not too high, like 0.20, 0.30. If you give them tasks in the same domain, artistic, for example, drawing task and collage, you get higher correlations, 0.4, 0.5. And if you give them the same task with a different details, drawing topic 1 and 2, you get correlations that are quite strong. So there is a degree of domain specificity, and being creative, teaching to be creative in one domain might not be the same thing as in another domain. How about, is creativity stable over time? We have data on children and we have data on adults. And this is a famous result from Dean Keith Simonton, in which in adults you can see over the adult lifespan there are moments when people are more or less creative in their career, more or less productive and producing original work. And this peak depends on the domain. So mathematicians tend to peak earlier than historians, for example, in their creative, productive work. Well, with children too, we find that they move, they develop it evolves. They are not stable and set in stone from the beginning at their level of creativity. And the last key point about the material sciences of creativity, before moving to the educational blueprint, is that I suggest that there's a link between everyday and great levels of creativity. Those with creative potential, children or adults, may end up to be the next Van Gogh and others like that. It's possible. And it's the same ingredients that come into play. Now, Van Gogh, he was not super creative his whole life long. He had a peak moment when everything came together in Arles in France. And he had there certain emotional state. He had experienced Millet, whose painting you see on your screen over on the bottom of the screen, which inspired him greatly for his compositions. He was in Arles, which had a certain kind of light and climate that reminded him of Japan, which he had never been to, but it reminded him of Japanese paintings, and that inspired him. He had support from his brother, Theo, and he had his friend Gauguin visiting in Arles, and that also stimulated him. So everything came together, and in a short period, he was able to produce almost 80% of all his famous works at that moment. So Van Gogh, a great creative person, not necessarily creative all the time, every day of his life. Okay, so that's some basic ideas on creativity. Now, how are we going to build the system? I'm going to talk about children and teachers, curriculum and classrooms, and then school administrators and leaders. Okay, so first of all, for the children and the teachers, this is the people involved in the daily life of school. What are we going to do here to build our system? First, we're going to think about how we can diagnose and capture the different kinds of creative potential that children might have that we might want to develop. And I'm going to show you how we've been working on doing that with APUC, a measure of creativity. And also, teachers themselves can serve as role models for creative behavior and how to evaluate student ideas for creativity. So first, how can we get an idea of a student's creative potential so that we can help educate that student and develop that creative potential and creative giftedness? Well, in our work on APUC, together with Maud Besançon and Baptiste Barbeau, and other collaborators, we've been working on, in each domain, for example, artistic domain, literary domain, and in this Congress, you can go hear about the new social creative problem-solving domain that's going to be presented. And we've been working on divergent exploratory thinking, and also converging, integrating, synthesizing in a creative way. And so we have different tasks that measure divergence and integration convergence in each domain. For example, in the artistic domain, we give kids a picture of a banana, and this is one child who made many drawings using the banana. That's divergent exploratory. Here, in our convergent integrative, we gave a child a set of pictures of objects. For example, a light bulb, a wooden mannequin person, a hat, a carrot, and this child made a little drawing of a room with a bed and a person's affairs, person's stuff, using those objects. It's a bit of an integrative idea, but it's not highly original, in fact. Here's another child who used those same objects in a more creative way. And so you see they transformed some objects. They made the light bulb became the body of a person. The lake was actually a rock we had given them, and it turned into a lake with the fish in it. Okay, so we measure these two kinds of things, divergence and convergent integrative, in each domain, and we can get for children their level of creative potential compared to other children in each of these kinds of creative thinking by domain, and their profile. So you could have a child who is with strong creative potential in the verbal linguistic, but not the visual artistic. You could have a child who is strong creative potential in a kind of creative processing like divergence, but not in convergent integrative. And so this helps to guide teaching for these children, to turn their potential into a reality. Now, part of guiding children is also helping them understand what is a creative work. Not everything they do is a great creative achievement. And so we did some studies, notably Martin Storm did some work in his PhD recently to check out if we can train teachers by showing them examples of more and less creative work to better, more coherently judge new work they'll see from more children coming along. And you see that the condition with training gave a lot higher index of interjudge agreement than the condition of teachers who had no training and just judged and were put together to see their coherent level. And so the effect size is a rather strong effect, 1.21 in Cohen's D. And so it's important for teachers to be able to evaluate and let kids know what does it mean when we say that's creative and that's not creative, to give them guidelines. Now, that's not the only thing, though, that teachers could do, because they're importantly role models. They can teach children for creativity, teach them the way to be, teach them by helping the children to take a risk, helping the children to engage divergent thinking. They can also teach creatively and serve as a role model for children, because by being a teacher and designing your own lesson and letting children know that this is a new way you're trying to give them the material about history or language or science, you're modeling for them what it is to be creative in the role of a teacher. And that's important too. Chambers did an important study in 1973 in which he found doctoral students who had graduated, had their PhD, and had gone on to publish innovative research. He located these people and had them nominate teachers that either were very important to help them be creative or very harmful to their being a creative person, according to the students, former students. And these are some characteristics that those helpful and harmful teachers had. They're positive or negative role models. So the positive role model teachers treated students as individuals, offered encouragement, supported independent thinking, expected excellence, and they were available outside the classroom. And the negative role model teachers, who hindered the creative development of these people who ended up to be creative, they discouraged the students, they lacked enthusiasm, they were quite critical, they were impersonal, authoritarian, and they favored rote learning in their classrooms. Here's one of the participants who talked about a teacher he really remembered. This teacher, he led me to challenge him. I remember debating him for 15 minutes during class on an idea from Goethe's Faust. It was the first time a quiet, analytical student, me, the person reporting this incident, had dared to oppose a professor on his own ground and was encouraged instead of being put down. In a study of Nobel Prize winners, every Nobel Prize winner was able to cite a specific incident with one of his or her teachers, often high school teachers, which made a difference in their scientific career and led them towards creative work. What about the next building block, the curriculum and the classrooms? Well, we're going to talk about a few points concerning this building block now. First of all, the curriculum. All schools do not deliver the same content or the same content in the same way. And in this study done by Maud Besançon in her dissertation work, we had schools in France that were classical, typical French schools that are not too focused on creativity. We had Montessori schools, and we had Freinet schools, which are also alternative pedagogical schools, kind of in a Montessori kind of way. And this just shows that kids sampled at different moments in their elementary school levels, in general, except at the so-called CE2 or fourth grade in France, tended to benefit from the Montessori-Freinet type of alternative pedagogical method compared to the typical French schools. And just suggests that there are ways in which the curriculum and mode of teaching in general affect creativity. If you look at research on how creativity training packages or modules, for example, the CPS, creative problem solving methods or exercises, the Purdue exercises or others like that, tend to influence children and adults in terms of developing their creativity, you find that meta-analyses of effect sizes of hundreds of studies of those programs range from 0.68 in a certain meta-analysis up through 0.90 in others, depending on which programs are examined and which creativity outcomes are examined. And so it's a moderate effect size, suggesting that there is an impact of training kids or adults with these creativity packages. What's in these packages? Partly, there are things to foster those cognitive and personality cognitive components that are the bricks and mortar of creativity. And partly, there are things to show children and adults how to do their work, the creative process that we mentioned. Okay. What about the physical climate? Well, that's in the classroom. We have two aspects. We have what we call the physical climate of the classroom, and we have what we call the social climate of the classroom. And this is all part of the curriculum and classroom environment part of the educational system. Well, this is just a little cartoon to suggest that some people work well in a messy office. If you come on over to Paris and you see my office, you'll think this looks really well organized, okay? And so there's been studies. In a room, do people do well if there's plants or no plants, green plants? Do they do well with certain colored walls, with window light, natural light, or just light from the ceiling like here? Do they do well in certain temperatures? And so there's been studies suggesting things like the presence of green plants is a positive factor for creativity in a room. The presence of natural light is a positive factor. The presence of windows is a positive factor. In a study with children, it was shown that having posters and funny pictures on the walls rather than blank walls in a classroom is a positive factor. There's also the social environment. That's important too. For example, time for thinking is important. Challenging work is important. Freedom, risk-taking support, intellectual debate, positive peer group, trust, humor, exchange of ideas, and reward and incentives to be creative is important. In fact, studies have shown that the same kids who don't look very creative, when you say you get points for giving us the right answer, if you tell them you get points for new original ideas, suddenly they're able to start producing those ideas to get those points that they so much want. Here's an example. In Illinois Math and Science Academy, located near Chicago, students there they have some time each week to work on any project they want to work on. It's free time, but they're at school. It's a live-in school, so they're not going out anywhere. And they have all Wednesday to do what they want. It's kind of like at 3M, where research scientists have 10% of their week's time and budget of their laboratory to do whatever they want. That kind of freedom led to the invention of Post-it notes. It's kind of like Google that gives its workers 20% of their time to try to invent new stuff for Google and make it better. And there's examples. At this school, there was one student who was named Peter Chu, and he was really into a kind of Dungeons and Dragons video game. It turns out that that video game had open source code, which he downloaded, and on Wednesdays, he learned the C language of programming, which wasn't part of his high school academy. He opened up that program, rewrote the program, and later went on to a very successful career in which he is the mastermind behind PayPal, which some of you may be using. Okay, what about the last building block? The last building block is the administrators and the leaders of the school system. Now, there's been a lot written about creative leadership. If the CEO of a major company doesn't have creativity on his or her agenda, it's likely that the lower managers and the workers at all the different levels don't have it on their agenda either. But many times the CEO, if you interview them, they'll say, creativity is very important for us. If you look into the mission statement of most companies, which you can find in their annual report or on internet sites, a very high percentage of companies say, our mission is to be creative, innovative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, they do nothing about it. It's just nice to say. And that's a little bit true also in educational policy guidelines too. We like to talk about it. But as I put here, if the leaders do not value it truly and make it a priority, we will not move from the 3 R's. The 3 R's is reading, writing, and arithmetic, to what we call the 4 C's, which relates to the 21st century skills I mentioned early on. The 4 C's are critical thinking, communication skills, creativity, and collaboration. And so one of those 4 C's is creativity. Also, you need to, as an administrator and leader in a school, provide access to knowledge about creativity. The teachers need to know how this thing works if they're going to be part of teaching it. They need to know the basic facts, and they need to have the resources, the programs for schools, and the guidelines to develop their own programs that can help kids be more creative. And also, the school needs a reward, recognition, and milestone system for creative work. If it's important, it's on the report card. That's the basic bottom line of all schools. If it's not important, it's not on the report card. And I wonder, in how many schools you know, creativity is on the report card. Not many, but it could be. Because, as you see, if you develop a culture of being able to evaluate creative work, if you have a class of kids and you ask them to do an assignment that involves inventing some new ideas, there will be a range from lowish to highish, more or less original thinking, and it can be graded. It's not extremely difficult, and teachers, as we saw, can learn through some training, short training, to do that in a coherent way. What's the top barriers to teaching creativity, according to a 2013 survey of those 4,000 educators and parents? Well, in the USA sample, people said, these are some of the 3 top reasons, that it's hard to teach creativity because the system is too reliant on testing. I'd say it's too reliant on testing standardized things about getting the answer right. The educators cannot go outside the curriculum, because that would take extra time and we won't have time to do the program. And there's a lack of resources to do this creative thinking thing. In Europe and Australia, the priorities are a little different in terms of top barriers. So they cite, first of all, the current educational curriculum. Secondly, misunderstanding the importance of creativity. That's setting the goals in the system. And third, restrictions on going outside the curriculum or lack of resources. And so it's very similar, but there's a slight difference in priorities. So administrators and principals and people in charge of educational systems, they need to redirect the ship, put it on the course towards creative giftedness. And so here's the conclusion coming up. In order to design this educational system favoring creative giftedness, enhancing creativity in the upper end, those with creative potential, but also in all children, finally, we need an approach that is multi-pronged. We need an approach that takes into account several things. We have to think about the human resources in the system. In other words, the children and the teachers. We need to think about diagnosing children's potential. Then we can help develop it. What teacher in mathematics says, I'm here to teach kids mathematics, and gives no pre-test at all because they don't care what students know already from last year? How many teachers do that? Okay. Secondly, you need teacher training on creativity. People need to know what we're talking about here, what's important to favor or not favor. And they can serve as role models, perhaps. There's a question running around. Does a teacher need to be creative to teach creativity? My answer is that it won't hurt, but it's not fundamentally necessary. Because you can put into place that class setting, those conditions to foster risk-taking, to try new things, even if you yourself would not try them, you can still put into place and model that kind of behavior so that students can see it's valued. Classroom design and curriculum support. You can restructure the physical space of a classroom. You can put in some of those things that might be favoring creativity. You can think about curricular support activities, introducing your information in ways that facilitate creative thinking. And finally, we have the last component of the blueprint is the school leadership making creativity a priority and putting that in the system as a goal that has to be achieved with milestones. And so I just end with this little idea, which it might be hard to read what's written below, but it says, thinking outside of the box is difficult for some people. Keep trying. The difficulty is that the educational system for so many years has been focused on Homo sapiens learning to become experts in everything they can know and do. And now we want perhaps to focus on that thing that's been given only 10% of the literature in giftedness studies, which is already a small set of all educational studies, that thing that we call creative giftedness. And so I hope that this has given you some overview of how we could do it.